Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Chat with Brandy, where we talk personal and business finance, taxes, and how to make money doing what you love. I am your host, bookkeeper and tax preparer, Brandy Miron, and this is episode number 29. Today, we have a special guest on the show. This is my friend, Rebecca Frederick of Frederick and Company. She is in Sherwood Park. Rebecca is a licensed insolvency trustee. She has been doing this for 15 years. I'm so excited to have you on the show today. On this show, we have talked a lot about debt previously. So episodes, the most recent one, episode 26 with Justine Cooper, we talked a little bit about credit restructuring and that kind of thing. And then way back last year in episodes 4 and 5, the budgeting episodes, we talked about debt and some different methodologies to paying down debt. And in that video, or in those videos, I said, you know, sometimes debt gets to be too much and there's no way for you to service it yourself. So that is where an expert like Rebecca would come in. So I'm so happy to have her on the show today. We're going to talk about
Thanks for having me.
Debt and the different when debt gets to be too much, I guess, is kind of the first thing. So Rebecca, I'll let you kind of talk and introduce yourself. So so you're in Sherwood Park, your office is in Sherwood Park.
Yeah, you bet.
So who are you servicing?
We really actually help all over Alberta in terms of like geographical space. We have people coming to us from Calgary, and you know, north like Fort Mac and east and west. We mostly we're a business mostly of referrals, and so you know, when someone refers us to take care of a tough financial situation, people we reach out and we can help people kind of anywhere in Alberta, which is really sweet.
Nice. Yeah, I imagine Fort McMurray is probably a big one the last few years.
Yeah, it has been. You know, we're seeing still some fallout from the fires. You know, homes that were you know, burnt down and that kind of thing, and people still paying mortgages on them, and then, you know, eventually, and still need to rent somewhere else in the meantime. And so it's been really tough for a lot of Fort Mac people. The one thing I will say though about being able to service people is that I do need to meet them at some point in the process, and so sometimes, you know, just once we need to hang out, and so we hang out and do a coffee once we know that we can definitely help them, because as you know, there's a lot of different options for helping people through their financial difficulty, and so we want to make sure that all other options are considered before you think about bankruptcy and proposals, because those should be, you know, any kind of settlement of debt is something that you want to think about. I think you need to understand what it looks like, but you're only going to pull the trigger when everything else isn't working for you, right?
Right. So let's kind of talk about, so in your experience, what are some really good indicators that debt is too much? Like they've maybe exhausted those options of like budgeting or like cutting back, that kind of thing.
Well, I think it's important to consider always trying to get some more information and just see, even if they a lot of people wait until they've kind of exhausted all of those options, and then the longer you wait, though, the less options that you have. So I encourage you to talk sooner rather than later to someone about how to restructure your debt. But when we're looking at debt is kind of one of those things where it's not one size fits all. Once you hit this number, it's too much or anything like that. And different people have different comfort levels around debt, right? Some people are really uncomfortable, and some people are super comfortable around it, right? And having lots of credit and that kind of thing. So it's a personal choice thing as well. But some indicators that some like kind of superficial indicators that debt might be becoming a little bit much is like not wanting to open those bills up, right? Moving money from one credit facility to another, right? So pay your credit card down, then take a cash advance and go pay a different credit card down. That's definitely an indicator. Usually when people get behind on their utilities and their rent or their mortgage, that's a big sign that things maybe aren't going as planned. And then if we're talking about business, you know, having accounts payable or accounts receivable past those 90-day marks, that's definitely an indicator that things maybe aren't going as well, like behind on rent, and then just cash flow problems, like having a hard time paying payroll. Like that's definitely an indicator that that maybe having a conversation is a good idea, just to kind of get some additional information. One of the things, though, for sure, that's if you find that you are regardless of those superficial indicators, you find that most of your conversations around finance are debt management related. I think that's a big indicator that maybe you should start having conversation with someone and looking at options, because when we're talking about financial health, as you know, right? Financial health is about asset retention, building assets over in the personal sphere. We're talking about building for retirement, having an emergency fund, maybe, a side savings account for vacations, things like that, right? And then, so those, building those assets, protecting those assets with insurance, whether that be life insurance or disability insurance and that kind of thing. And then debt repayment is one of those things as well, because having debt is one way that you can utilize debt to kind of get yourself moving forward. Perfect example, getting a mortgage so that you can buy a house, right? And build some equity. So debt repayment is only one of those things. But if that's all you're focusing on, then that can be an indicator that maybe, again, you want to talk to somebody about seeing if you're missing an option out there that would get you moving forward a little bit sooner.
Yeah, like one of the things when I'm working with people on budgets, you're totally right. Like if the main focus is debt right away, which it often is, if you're thinking about budgets, a lot of times you're thinking, I just got to get out of the red. A lot of the times what we'll do a debt repayment plan. And if the debt, and so I'm not talking mortgages here, but if the consumer debt is going to take longer than 3 years to pay off, that's usually when I would refer somebody to Rebecca. And that doesn't necessarily mean that she's going to say for sure, bankruptcy is right for you, but it's just like, I think that for me is kind of the tipping point where it's like, we need to look at maybe a different method. And I know, I love referring to Rebecca because right as when we first met, we found common ground right away that we both have a real passion for educating the public, particularly in personal finance, and for you, the insolvency kind of issues. So I guess the straightforward answer here is if you feel like debt is consuming your thoughts, or like you brought up a great example of using those cash money stores, that's just a real quick way to get yourself in trouble with those when you're kind of like you say, taking from one credit area to pay another credit area. That's tough, right?
Yeah. And sometimes there's a lot of stress, when you owe money and you're trying to shuffle it around and make it work, right? So having someone that can come in with an extra set of eyes and take a look at it like from a high level, and then also eliminate the emotional response to things, right? And you're like, I really love that Jeep, I want to keep the Jeep, but it's $20,000. You owe $20,000 more than what it's worth. We can have those conversations. Does not say that you have to get rid of the Jeep or that you can keep, that you should keep the Jeep, but it's all about cash flow and making sure that you have enough money to go around, that you can live the life you want to lead and pay your obligations and things like that. And ultimately not just pay those minimum payments and keep that cycle going indefinitely, but get you moving, right? Get you moving forward. My tagline at Frederick and Company is, helping people move from financial distress to financial success. And so that's the kind of transition like we like to see, and whether that's people are doing it themselves and we kind of formulate a plan, or whether that's a proposal or bankruptcy. But we talk about all of those options so that they can make that choice, right? I think it's really important that they're able to make that choice themselves. If someone's saying you should do this or you should do that, that's not they don't have to live with those consequences. You do, right? So you want to find someone who is giving you enough information that you can make that choice and how to get moving forward. Yeah. So can you talk about a little bit how the process goes? Like if someone makes an appointment to come in and see you, what is the process in terms of how does the first meeting go? What kind of things are you discovering during that meeting? Well, in that first meeting, one of the things we're going to ask for is some documentation that supports like what assets you have, what debts you have, and what income you have. Because what we want to do is give you the most realistic numbers, right? If we're using, it's about this and it's about that, then I can give you about the right answer, right? Yeah. So that's the first thing we do is gather some information, and then when people come in, then what we do is with that information, we're able to take a look at cash flow and basically like on the personal side, your budget, right? And see what you've got coming in and where all that money's going, and then help you figure out where you want to go from there in terms of your cash flow, what's a manageable number for your debt. And then we look at what is paying it out on your own look like.
Yes.
Do we have any moves to help us get there, such as, do you have any assets that you can sell?
Yes.
Of course, there are certain assets that are protected from creditors. RSPs. Those are the first to go, and because they're the most liquid. But in a bankruptcy or proposal situation, they're protected. You get to keep those, right? So I really encourage the people before they start selling RSPs off and really kind of jeopardizing what their retirement's going to look like, right? To start
see a trustee first.
Just to have a conversation, right? Maybe that makes sense. But probably if you're like 50 and older, it's not going to make a lot of sense because you don't have a lot of time left to build that back up again, right? So
and there's a tax implication when
there absolutely
when
is.
You cash an RSP as well. So sometimes it's like, okay, I'm going to take out my entire retirement savings, pay off maybe not even all my debt,
right? Yeah,
and then the next year have to pay tax on it, and you really could have filed for proposal or bankruptcy, and that RSP might have been protected anyways, right? So I think it's only the last 12 months of contributions are not protected.
That's based in the Bankruptcy and Insolvency Act, but actually property is something that's managed by the province, and so that's the minimum across Canada. But in Alberta, actually, the Civil Enforcement Act is quite generous. It's all RSPs are exempt.
Nice. Okay.
Yeah, and even RESPs are exempt. So registered disability savings plans are exempt. But one of the things that's not exempt is TFSAs.
Right.
And that is a new kind of burgeoning trend where people are kind of not really looking at RSPs as the avenue they want to go. They're looking more at TFSAs. And so we see sometimes people coming in with big TFSAs that would have to go to their creditors. So the value of that would have to go to creditors.
Yes.
Instead of RSPs. So when you're facing financial difficulties, right, or if things are a little, you're not sure, you just got divorced, you're just kind of getting resettled, talking to your financial advisor and your financial planner, which I'm sure you've along that line, making sure though that you're looking at if things are a little unsteady, I'd be investing in RSPs because you again protected versus TFSAs until you're on your feet.
Great point. So just the takeaway from that is if you feel like you're on the point of you're going to take out RSPs to pay down debt, see a trustee first.
Yes.
It's not necessarily like you're going to definitely file for bankruptcy or you're definitely going to file a proposal, but at least get that advice first. Get that education first. The more information you have,
the better.
The better.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm really glad that was brought up because I know that's a huge misnomer or misinformation that people have is about that RSP, and I've seen it personally many times, and it's always sad to have to see you pay the tax and your debt's not even paid down. And anyways, so let's talk about the kind of like, let's say you had the meeting, you decided insolvency, some sort of insolvency methodology is the way to go. Let's talk about the options that there are and the differences between them. So bankruptcy versus, I guess, a proposal would be the two main.
Right.
Yeah.
So because it's so individualized, it's one of those things that's a little hard to, like, I could kind of give you the rattle out the stuff from the bankruptcy. Broad, yeah, exactly. And then it doesn't really sink in. So like if we use an example of someone who has, some household furnishings, some personal effects, right? They have that RSP that's fully exempt, and then they have a quad, right? But you need the shirt on your back. You need a car to get back and forth to work. You need also the bed you sleep in, right? So if you think about your property in terms of like what you need versus like extras, the one thing that stands out as kind of an extra in this case is the quad. Right? So the value of that quad would have to come into the pot in a bankruptcy scenario. So that doesn't mean you got to sell your quad, because there is a lot of misconception around bankruptcy means that the trustee is going to come in and take it all, right? That's not what happens. What ends up happening in a bankruptcy is a rebalancing between you and your creditors. You can't pay everything,
right? And
you can't pay nothing,
right?
What is that fair midpoint? Well, that's going to be different for everybody because different people with different circumstances
Yes.
have differing abilities to pay.
Yes.
And that's the intention around bankruptcy. And it sounds, bankruptcy is such a bad word, but really it is about rebalancing. It's about making it fair for everybody because, unfortunately, if you're looking at filing a bankruptcy, that's not the ideal thing, but it's also not ideal for your creditors to not get paid in full. So you're both, so we're looking for ultimately that win-win that brings everything together, that helps you get moving forward, the creditor moves on, and off we go. So with that rebalancing in mind, assets that you need, you're able to kind of retain. Now you don't need, in terms of house and car, you don't need a mansion and a Maserati, right? You just need someplace to live. And so there are limits in terms of how much is exempt in a house and how much is exempt in a car and household furnishings and personal effects and that kind of thing. And so, but those limits are meant to be kind of reasonable amounts. And then anything above that would be a number that has to get chipped in. Okay. Now, for a house, people are worried about losing their house, right? Of course. If I have that extra money, am I going to lose my house? No. The value of that amount that's above the exemption, after we take into consideration the mortgage, of course, right? Yes. If that's $30,000, then $30,000 has to come into the pot for your creditors. Now that could come in terms of monthly payments, or you could look at selling the house, but most trustees are really pretty reasonable when it comes to how is that number going to come in, right? Okay. Of course, you want to take into consideration whether that bankruptcy is going to last 13 years, right, to pay that in. Yes. Then that becomes a pro and con. Like, do you want it to last 13 years? That's a long time for a bankruptcy. Right. Right. So we're always looking at things from a cash flow perspective as well, and that way to make sure that it's a reasonable time frame as well. Okay. So a couple questions. So one, you were talking about the amount for a house. Mm-hmm. Does that calculation take into like the number of dependents you have? Not for the house exemption. Okay. So what it's looking at is, if we imagine you have a house that's $400,000. Okay. And you have a mortgage of $300,000. Yes. Then that means there is $100,000 of equity in that house. Correct. Yes. Okay. And this is we're just using simple numbers here, but $40,000 of that is exempt. Okay. So that means that there's $60,000 of equity left in that house. For every Albertan. It's the $40,000. That's right. Kind of roll. I got you. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Now, if half of that house is yours and half of that house is your spouse's, right, then it's 30-30. So only 30 available to your creditors. Okay. Does that make sense? Yes. Yeah. So those are the kinds of things that we're taking into consideration when you're looking at a bankruptcy versus a proposal. Yeah. And so when we talk about number of people in the household, that relates to income. So because bankruptcies primarily based on assets and income. Okay. And it will also be based on transactions in the last 1 to 5 years. Okay. So as well. So if you've sold your, yacht to your brother for $1 for love and affection, right? Like that's probably gonna come back to haunt you, right? Yeah. But that makes sense. And most of us know that that's probably not the greatest thing to do. Right? Because if you're driven by fairness and transparency, yes, which is what the intention of the Bankruptcy and Insolvency Act is around, then like you're going to that's going to kind of come up, obviously, and your creditors are going to be not super happy about that. So the trustee has a way of dealing with those kinds of transactions. So a lot of times people can, in those gut reactions, think about doing those things. I encourage you not to do that stuff. Mm-hmm. Go talk to a trustee. Just see what we're talking about here. Mm-hmm. See what the cost is and that kind of thing before you start making any kinds of those moves that we probably know are a little sneaky, right? Yeah. So what's the average bankruptcy length? Well, the bankruptcy length, the average length is so dependent on the performance of the individual, because so when we talk about the income, we talk about income and assets being the drivers. Yes. But if you don't pay that income payment, payment that's related to your income, right, into the pot, then bankruptcy can last indefinitely, right? If you don't do your 2 counseling sessions, if you don't do your income and expense statements. So there's a bunch of strings that are kind of attached in a bankruptcy. Mm-hmm. There's a bunch of things you have to do because to keep the creditors happy. Just to fulfill, because with bankruptcy, you're basically under a period of review. So the income that you make during that period of time is going to be reviewed, and then the surplus payment or not depending on if you
if
have
your income changes
right,
during
exactly. Yeah, that your income is averaged over the period of the bankruptcy. So
right. Okay.
today, if someone files for bankruptcy and they said, how much do I owe? I really don't know, because I don't know what the next 2 years looks like for you.
True.
And then if you got an inheritance, you got a disability tax credit, a raise, right? If you got an insurance payout, those are called windfalls, and those have the potential of coming into the estate as well. So it really is one of those things where it's kind of hard to put our finger on the number. But what I can tell you in a bankruptcy is what things will change it, right? Okay. How many people in the household? The more people, the more money you need for essentials, right? So that's going to change that income payment number. Okay. Right? We call that surplus income.
So if you had a baby during your bankruptcy, for example.
Exactly. Okay. Or if you got divorced, right? And now you're a family of one, right? Yeah. And so that changes things. Whether you've been bankrupt before or not, that changes things because the term in a bankruptcy is 9 to 21 months for a first-time bankrupt. And it's 24 to 36 months for a second-time bankrupt. So it gets tougher the second time through. Okay. And then any of those after acquired assets. And go to court, and like there's just
a lot of moving
there's a lot of moving pieces, and that's kind of one of the things that makes bankruptcy and proposal different.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah,
completely.
Because when we're talking about proposals, what we're talking about is making a better offering than what a bankruptcy is. Yes. So we need to get a baseline, get an idea what bankruptcy looks like today. Yes. Right? But we can't tell the future. So we just go off today's numbers, right? Today it looks like $4,000 is going to go into the bankruptcy for your creditors. Yes. Then that means that a proposal just needs to offer that better advantage to creditors. So instead of $4,000, are your creditors willing to get twice that, $8,000, right? Or perhaps if you had the ability to have someone contribute a third-party deposit, or if you had RSPs where you wanted to put $5,000 down, right, and pay them all off today. So instead of waiting 2 years to get, $4,000 into bankruptcy, you could get $4,000 today as a creditor. Okay. Right? Does that sound appealing? Yes. Probably, right?
So often a proposal would be more appealing to the creditors. What are some of the advantages to the debtor?
The certainty of knowing how much you're going to pay monthly.
Okay, yeah, sure.
And to know that
you could get a raise while you're under proposal, and it doesn't matter. That's not going to change your monthly payments in a proposal.
Correct. Okay. So once you've made a deal with your creditors and they've accepted that deal, now you're making your monthly payments. If you win the lottery, you get a raise or whatever, just pay off your proposal quicker.
Nothing's going to change that.
Yeah. And it gives you the flexibility of paying it off sooner, which is nice. Yeah.
Right. And there's none of that looking at your assets really with a proposal, is there?
We're going to look at everything we look at in a bankruptcy. Okay. Right? So if there is that, using that earlier example of the $30,000 equity in the house. Yes. Right? If that's going to come to creditors in a bankruptcy, then we have to make a better offering in the proposal.
Got you.
Right? Yeah. So if they're going to get 30, then we need to look at maybe a proposal for $40,000 or $50,000. Now I'm using pretty rough numbers here, but just as an illustration of how that would play out. So in that case, somebody could, I've set things up where people can get a second mortgage and then just pay it down in one fell swoop. Yes. So there is a lot of interesting ways that we can make it work.
And it's obviously not one size fits all.
No. We can do it a bunch of different ways. We have people that are seasonal, so they make a smaller monthly payment and then a big payment when they know that they're going to be making really good money, so that in the winter they're not, or the summer or whenever their slow time is, they're not struggling to make that payment. And so we are really flexible. We're always trying to think outside the box of how is this going to be the most successful thing for this person, right?
And get you back on the right track, like you said, financial success.
Yeah, exactly.
When it comes to credit and how a bankruptcy and a consumer proposal affects your credit, can you describe kind of the difference between those two?
Yeah, it's both bad. But so is not paying your creditors. Well, and that's kind of the deal,
Yeah.
right? I mean,
Yeah.
if you're not paying your creditors, you're bruising your credit rating
Yes.
every time you're late or
Your
every time.
collections, like those are bad. Yes.
Yeah. And if you've maxed out your credit, that's bad for credit, for your credit rating as well,
Yes.
right? So there are some people that come to see us and they have great credit rating. They've been managing it the whole time, but they know that they're at the end of being able to manage that. The house of cards is about to come down. And so we have people with great credit and we have people with bad credit that come and see us. Either way, both of the good credit or bad credit, people can end up looking at a bankruptcy or proposal, right? So, but you're right. What you're doing is you're comparing it to, if I continue to manage this on my own, what's my level of success? And then what am I compromising? Because you can compromise a lot of things, and is a personal choice for everybody. Maybe you want to work 2 jobs or 3 jobs to get this paid down, right? Inevitably, if you're choosing to pay $1,000 down towards debt, then that's $1,000 you're not spending on something else, such as an emergency fund, savings for a vacation, maybe retirement, right? And so how old you are, your ability to continue to earn money and that kind of thing is going to factor in. Personal circumstances matter, right? So there's a bunch of things that that you can compromise along the way, and credit rating is one of them, right? So if you have to settle, if the numbers the numbers don't lie. So if we look at your budget and we see how much is available to pay down debt, and then we look at how much it would cost you to pay down the debt that you have on your own, if those are not sinking, right, and you don't have enough money to manage that, then looking at some sort of settlement is probably a good idea just to get educated about, right? Some people come and see us and they say, I'm going to try it on my own. I fully support that, because if you can do it on your own, that is the best thing for you, because then you maintain your credit rating, and then you're meeting your commitments, which feels great, right? But what I encourage people to do is make a note in their calendar for 6 months from now and put all the debt totals that you have today in that calendar entry for 6 months from now. And then when you get there, you take a look and see how you're doing, right? See if it's working, or if you're kind of just, bobbing at the same level, right? And then you can at that point go, okay, is there anything else I can do to make this more manageable, right? Maybe you sell your house and move into a basement suite. There's a bunch of compromises you can make. Maybe you bring someone in to rent a room from you, right? There's a lot of different ways to get there. It just depends on what you want to do, right?
So as far as I'm aware, for a bankruptcy, once you're discharged, bankruptcy would stay on your credit report for 7 years. Is that correct?
Almost. So people said 7 years before, because bankruptcy used to be 9 months, and then it was 6. It was 6 years after that.
I see. Okay.
Unless you're a second time bankrupt, in which case it is 14 years.
Wow.
After you're done. So it makes a big difference. Yeah. And then with a proposal, it's 3 years.
Okay.
Now, in both of those scenarios, you can start reestablishing your credit today. Like, as soon as you file a bankruptcy or proposal, we encourage you to start reestablishing. Some people want a little break from credit, which I totally get. But then, get back on the horse, because unfortunately in Canada, you need credit in order to have a good credit rating.
It's so true.
In Europe, I understand that good credit is you don't have credit. So
not
it's just interesting.
Not the same here.
So you kind of always have to dance with the devil a little bit. And so the key, since we all need to do that, we need to have, those skills in place. And what we talk about in the counseling sessions that come along with the proposal or the bankruptcy is, how do you reestablish that? How do you manage that a little bit differently this time around?
Yes, nice. Okay, so let's talk about the ways that people can kind of avoid insolvency. And I know that we kind of already talked about taking the money out of the RSP thing, and avoiding that before you talk to a trustee. Can we talk a little bit about consolidation loans and some of the methodologies that sometimes come perhaps before a trustee meeting?
Right. So in an attempt to avoid an insolvency, like, what do people typically do? Right.
And do's and don'ts around that.
Yeah. So, I mean, based on what we've already talked, you can tell that I'm I'm not a big fan of selling exempt assets.
Right. So the RSPs again.
Exactly. Without knowing that it's going to fix the problem.
Yes.
Right. And that it's not going to create a different problem down the road.
Mm-hmm.
We want to look at the numbers and see, is this going to make sense for you long term? Again, financial distress to financial success.
Yes.
Not financially less uncomfortable. Right. Like that's not great. Right.
Yeah.
So, so we want to get people moving forward and thinking about it from all perspectives. And sometimes it can be a little bit of a knee-jerk reaction to sell those RSPs, right? We want to make sure that that makes the most sense. And so selling the RSPs is definitely, don't do that knee-jerk reaction. Talk to somebody, make sure it makes sense, right?
Or even a home equity line of credit. Like sometimes, like you say, a second mortgage might be the answer. Sometimes if your entire equity is exempt, as you say, that may not be the answer to do that. So again,
right,
before you are taking on a high interest consolidation loan, or you're taking on a second mortgage, or you're selling your RSPs, talk to a trustee. It's free to talk to a trustee,
totally
by the
free.
way.
Totally free.
And literally they're experts in it. They're experts in debt management. So as much as I can, I would encourage you to sit down with someone like Rebecca or her team and talk to them before you make those huge decisions.
And you should be talking to somebody like to get educated, right?
Yeah.
And just get a sense of where you're at, and then where you can kind of where you can go from here, and what options that you have. One of the other things that people tend to do is get more debt. Mm-hmm. That never helps, because now you have another payment that is coming out of your already tightly squeezed budget, right? So I get it. I get why people feel like that would be helpful. But I can tell you from many times of seeing people in that similar situation, it doesn't help. And the worst case is when you go to those really high interest lenders, and then they ask you, do you have any household furnishings in there? And you're like, oh yeah, I've got some. And then they secure your household furnishings to the loan at 29%. So now it kind of locks you into making that payment, or potentially giving up those household furnishings, right? So I guess, and I think the worst case is that with those kinds of loans is when they put it on the house, because then there's no getting out of that really high interest loan. And so those are the things that people can do in those high stress situations, in attempt to get things, to right the ship. But unfortunately, those aren't always the best solutions, and then having a conversation with someone who can give you maybe a 10,000 foot perspective on things, just to kind of get it out of your own head. Because sometimes, I don't know about you, but when I'm worrying about something, it just churns around and around, and it's hard to tell the top from the bottom sometimes when I'm really kind of chewing on something. And so it always helps me to have a conversation with someone. But finances are sometimes tricky. Sometimes we don't want to have those conversations with everybody, right?
And there can be a lot of emotion tied to it. So I think the point that we're trying to get across here is, if you have a debt problem, a lot of times trustee would be like the absolute last step that they would take. I want you to reverse your thinking on that. I'm not saying you're 100% going bankrupt. I'm saying have a conversation with a trustee first. They do have your best interest in mind in terms of getting you back on the right track, or at least the good ones do. And that's not necessarily the case when it comes to lenders. So that's why I would say, have this conversation first. Her advice might be, go take a second mortgage on your house. That might be the best advice that you need. But again, the more information you have, the better. So we're going to wrap this up. So Rebecca, where can we find you? I will link Rebecca's Facebook page to the show notes and the comments, but where else can we find you online?
fcdebtfree.ca is our website. Yeah.
Okay. So FC like Frederick Company, debt free.
Yeah.
And then you're on Facebook.
Yeah, you bet.
Are you on Instagram?
I am not.
Okay.
No, not very many pictures of it just doesn't get that exciting. You know, here's another picture of a dollar bill, you know, I don't know. Yeah, so it didn't go that way.
Okay, awesome. Awesome. So if you have any questions on that kind of stuff, please feel free to reach out to Rebecca. And thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely.
It's such a pleasure to talk to somebody else who is so passionate about education and being able to kind of take that education and really give it to their clients in a way that's going to help them be successful. So it's my pleasure.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you guys so much. And I hope you guys got something out of this video, and we will see you next week. We're ending it, I promise.